Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and I am Gary Michuta, your host and sensei for the next hour, where we do the throwdown. We learn how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. And I want to welcome all of you and wish you all a happy Holy Thursday. Happy Holy Thursday. And today's show, this Holy Week, we're trying to tailor, the apologetics show more or less to, spirituality, focusing on Holy Week. We had William Albrecht come on. We talked about the sacrifice of the Mass. And actually, we're going to pick up that theme because, after all, the institution of the Lord's Supper is and has been since the beginning of the Protestant Reformation a divisive point. And so we're going to have our good friend, the one, the only Matt Swaim, come on board at the end of the first break. We're going to talk about Catholic versus Protestant views of Holy Communion and the Lord's Supper, and kind of, delineate how non-Catholics approach it, look at it, and, compare and contrast with the Catholic position, the real presence of the Eucharist and what exactly the Mass is all about. So lots of great stuff coming up on the other side of the break. Also, we have our finding of the fallacy for today, which is, for you Latinists, you'll love it. It is the ipse dixit fallacy, which in Latin means he said it himself. Okay. And I think you can kind of figure out from that word, or two words, that the meaning of that particular fallacy. We also meet an early church father on the show every episode, and today is no different. Today's early church father is St. Vincent of Lorraine. A very important, very interesting early church father indeed. And, before we get things rolling here, I want to give a shout-out to all of you watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. And I also like to welcome all of you listening to radio around the country and also via podcast around the world, either through our handy-dandy phone app or at the Virgin Most Powerful's flagship website, which, of course, is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Welcome aboard. Great to have you with us. And also, thank you so much for all of you who have subscribed to Hands-On Apologetics channel on YouTube. I also want to thank all of you for, sharing the program, letting people know about it, because sharing is caring, especially when it comes to apologetics. And it's the guests we have, I think, are great opportunities. If you hear something interesting that you think your neighbor may be interested in, you could share it with them. Who knows? Maybe they'll get used to coming to the dojo and working out with us, and that'd be great. The more the merrier. All right, so let's see. If you have a question for Matt Swaim, by the way, you can give us a call toll-free at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Or you can always email us at questions@handsonapologetics.com. All right, so why don't we jump into our finding the fallacy for today, the ipse dixit fallacy. He said it himself in English. And basically, the ipse dixit fallacy is an assertion without proof. It's a dogmatic expression of opinion. The fallacy of defending a proposition by baldly asserting that it is just how it is, and that's all there is, right? Because I say so. That in itself makes it a fact. The claimant declares an issue to be intrinsic and unchangeable. this is, I think, something that parents often pull on their children, after they're being pestered by many questions. It's like, no, this is how it is, and don't ask me why, because that's how it is. Well, that's also used in argumentation sometimes. People just boldly assert something is true without offering any kind of evidence or support for that position, and they act as if it's unassailable, that obviously there can't be any other viewpoints in regards to that, and it certainly couldn't be wrong. You find this a lot in popular blogs, popular websites. You don't find it too much in scholarly works, namely because the other scholars would jump on him if he dared to do it. But you do find that often on social media, stuff like that. People just declare things as if it's just the unassailable truth, which is kind of sad. Yeah, okay. And that is our finding of the fallacy for today. Also, let's meet the early church father. Church father for today is St. Vincent of Lérins, who died sometime before AD 450. What's interesting about St. Vincent of Lérins is he never actually was formally canonized. He was canonized, so to speak, by Cardinal Baronius. If you remember, he is the cardinal that responded to the Centuriators, the Lutheran Centuriators. But anyway, he entered his name into the Roman Martyrology that he was commissioned to prepare. And Tillemont, the patrologist, expressed some doubts as to whether or not the cardinal actually had sufficient grounds to do that. But, of course, Tillemont was not questioning, it was only questioning the cardinal's historical evidence, not the sanctity of St. Vincent, which, is, I think, acknowledged by all. Who was St. Vincent? Well, St. Vincent was a priest and a monk in Lérins, an island monastery near Nice. He is known as the author of 3 works, the Objectiones, which is an anti-Augustinian work, which is now lost, but against which Prosper of Aquitaine wrote one for St. Augustine's position. So we have a lost work. We also have really his most important work, which is the Commentatori, or the Commentoria, or the Commentatorium. I've heard it all 3 ways. Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers has a Commentoria. And basically, we'll get to that. That's the work that you're probably most familiar with. And if a manuscript attribution is correct, there appears to be a bunch of passages from Augustine's works dealing with the Trinity and Incarnation, which is designed largely against the Nestorian heresy, and these are attributed to St. Vincent of Lérins. So possibly 3 works. But really it's the Commentatori, or the Commentatorium, or however you want to put the name on, that really is the bulk of and the most important work of St. Vincent. It's not entirely incredible that Vincent should have made use of Augustine as is exhibited in the Exurba. In other words, he uses Augustine, so this fragment very well could be him. However, he also was something of a semi-Pelagian, and so he did have problems with Augustine. It's interesting in the Commentatori that St. Vincent of Lérins, although he may oppose certain things that Augustine may have said, he actually held Augustine in very high reverence because he never actually mentions him by name, of all things. So let's talk a little bit about what is the Commentatori. Well, it's basically, Jurgens translates that as the notebooks. It's written around AD 434. It's a translation of various notebooks that had come down to us in its entirety. It's not entirely certain why it has not been, come down in its entirety. Certainly, it was written as originally two books. The second one's lost. There's a couple of traditions as to why it was lost. None of them really seem to shake out. One story was that when St. Vincent of Lérins was about to publish, he was going to have both works published, but he lost the second manuscript, the second book, and he was just too disheartened and tired to reproduce it again. So instead he made an outline of it from memory, and published it along with the first book. Well, that's one theory. The problem is the outline that we have with the commendatory or the notebooks is that it doesn't really seem to match his second book. In fact, it seems to be more or less an outline of the first book. But anywho, we've noted also that Vincent never names Augustine, though he does write at no great length against the novelty of Augustine's theory of grace. But he never names himself either in this work. The author calls himself Peregrinus, that is, a pilgrim. But it cannot be doubted that Vincent is Peregrinus. He is the pilgrim. Very little of Vincent's semi-Pelagianism comes through in this work. And if we knew nothing of him except what he wrote down in the notebooks, his semi-Pelagian tendencies probably would have escaped notice entirely. But knowing that Prosper of Aquitaine, the content of Vincent's objections, there are a few places in the notebooks where you could read between the lines and see him as an opponent of St. Augustine. Let's see. Probably the most important thing of the commendatory is this principle, a divine law that Vincent of Lorraine states, and this is really important in apologetics. Vincent develops the notion that our faith is based on the authority of divine law, which must be understood and interpreted in the light of the tradition of the Church. And this tradition, if it need be discovered, is what is held everywhere, always, and by all or nearly all the people. That's known as the canon of St. Vincent of Lorraine. And I hear the music coming up, so that is our early church father for today, St. Vincent of Lorraine. Coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to be talking with Master Apologist Matt Swaim about Protestant Catholic views on the Holy Eucharist and the Lord's Supper. Stay tuned.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end, and God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And, during the break, I missed the message that was in the chat room, so I want to address it really quick before we bring up our guest. Someone asked me to say a few words about the word remembrance, because if you remember in the institution narrative of the Eucharist, it's recorded, Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." And the word remembrance, I think, is one of the most misunderstood words in the New Testament. If you look at how it's used in the Greek Old Testament, you find, I believe it's used 6 times altogether. 5 of the 6 times has to do with something which makes known that a sacrifice is being offered. And only once is it used just simply to remember something. So when Jesus says, "Do this as a remembrance of me," you could translate it as offer this memorial sacrifice of me. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. Hopefully that answers your question in the forum. But it's good. It's on topic because we're going to talk about Protestant and Catholic, differences and sameness, I guess you could say, between our understandings of Holy Communion and, of course, the Mass or the Lord's Supper. And to help us do so, we have the one, the only Matt Swaim. I could go through all the bio for Matt, but you already know him. He's a regular on the show. He's a convert to Catholicism. It was in the United Methodist, Nazarene, and Free Methodist congregations. Of course, you've heard him on Catholic radio for over a decade, and he now works for the Coming Home Network. Actually, since 2016, and by the way, the Coming Home Network website is chnetwork.org. And here he is, the one, the only, the legend himself, Matt Swaim. Yeah, I wish we had some sort of applause or something.
You were right on topic there with that question from the forum. What's funny is that word anamnesis.
Yes.
That corresponds to the liturgical meaning of what it is to sort of remember what's happening. It comes from the same word as amnesia. And a lot of people think that amnesia means to forget things. Well, yeah, it does, but it means most specifically to forget who you are, right? So anamnesia is to remember, like, this is something that's at the core of your identity that you're remembering.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Well, thanks. That's great. We start off the show with a Greek lesson.
That's all the Greek I got, Gary. I can't go any further.
Yeah, we can just drop the mic and just end it.
Heroes or something.
Right. Okay, well, let's, with your work at the Coming Home Network, you hear a variety of different points of view from all sorts of different Protestant traditions. And I'm sure, the understanding of the Mass and Holy Communion, it's got to be one of the most diverse of all, different
extremely
opinions.
Yeah, it's extremely diverse. It was diverse even, depending on which kind of congregation you're going to. It can be diverse even within the congregation itself, because it's not always necessarily defined what is meant by Holy Communion. So, for instance, we would talk about it as a sacrament, where a lot of denominations would call it as an ordinance. By sacrament, we mean that it confers grace. But by ordinance, what a lot of non-Catholic Christians, and this goes for a lot of different ones of them, they mean that it's something that Jesus told us to do. So it doesn't necessarily do anything or confer anything. Baptism is often considered the same way, right? We don't think that baptism does anything. We just know that Jesus told us to do it. And within that, so you can get everything from consubstantiation, which, is common in a lot of sort of like higher liturgical forms of Christianity, which they believe that in Holy Communion, both Jesus and the bread and wine are there, whereas we Catholics believe that it's completely transformed. It just looks like bread and wine. But you get symbolism, memorialism, where it's like it's just bread and wine. We're just trying to remember this thing that Jesus did for us.
Right.
As a result, if that's the case, if it's just a symbol, then you can do all kinds of things with how you set it up, what you say about it, who partakes. So, for instance, in the Methodist tradition, and this isn't for every single church, but at least historically, you didn't have to be baptized in order to receive communion. You just had to have the right disposition of spirit. Whereas, certain Baptists would say you have to be baptized in order to receive communion. But even that's not standardized, because there's not a Baptist Pope, Gary, who's setting all this stuff out.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's such a wide variety. Yeah, I'd be curious what kind of scripture passages they would go to establish that point that you would have to be baptized to receive Holy Communion.
Well, it'd be the same thing that St. Paul says, and it was at First or Second Corinthians, whichever one has the institution words that are actually used at Mass when he talks about receiving the body and blood unworthily. Okay. And that's a verse that not a lot of people really know what to do with if you don't have a belief in something like transubstantiation. It was something that always confused me as a kid, because it's a pretty strong command. If you drink the cup and eat the bread unworthily, it's pretty strong consequences. Paul says this is why some of you are sick and some have died, right? You're guilty of profaning the body and blood of Christ if you eat this cracker with the wrong mindset. I mean, what are you supposed to think about that?
That's true.
And especially because I saw it presented it with varying levels of reverence depending on where I was. So, if I'm in the context of, well, let's just take, for instance, the Nazarene Church or the original United Methodist Church that I remember, and I don't remember much about that one because I was very young. But there was a Babylon Bee article a while back, and the headline was "The local Protestant congregation celebrates potlucks monthly and the Lord's Supper quarterly." That's kind of the experience that I had. I wasn't even sure when and how we decided when we were going to celebrate it. But we'd have sometimes those trays that have the little sort of ringed cup holders, and you'd pass the tray. Everybody takes a cup as it goes down. Same thing with, essentially it was just a little smaller than an oyster cracker that you'd take. But I also went to places where you'd pass a baguette around and everybody rips off a hunk, and you dip it in the thing of Welch's. And then there was other times. I remember a music festival that I used to work for, Christian Music Festival. They'd have a big communion service on one of the afternoons, and they'd have the what some Protestants call the Lunchables communion, which is where it's the plastic cup, layer of foil, cracker, layer of plastic. You peel off the one, you get the cracker. You peel off the one, you get and then at the end of the day, what do you think happens to those cups? They're in big industrial-sized black trash bags scattered all over the festival grounds. Right. So when you're seeing that and you're seeing that variety of practice, or when you're seeing in a written story that we just published, a conversion story on the Coming Home Network site where she was at some thing where they consecrated, well, they didn't consecrate, but they did communion with Cheez-Its and Sprite. How are you supposed to know what it means to profane the body and blood of Christ?
Yeah.
In communion.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's, you're right. I mean, and there's the variety of reverence. Matt, just looking at just the general landscape of Protestantism in general, I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the people who believe in the real substantial presence is probably a minority. The majority would see the memorial view that it's just purely symbolic.
That is by far the memorial view. And what's interesting is that's even held by Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses, and you've had run-ins with several of them, so you know this, that this is a big week for them because they only observe one liturgical feast per year. And it would have been, what's today? It's today the 9th? It would have been Tuesday is when they celebrated it this year, the memorial of the Passion of the Lord, or I can't remember what the technical term is for it. Yeah. And if you ask them, they're like, Jesus never told us to celebrate his birthday. Jesus never told us to celebrate Easter. He only told us to do one thing in remembrance of him. All right? And that was communion. But even then, if you go to one of those, the only people allowed to receive are people who are part of the 144,000 laid out in the book of Revelation. So they believe it's not even a symbol, they believe it's a memorial, but even they have a stronger sense of what it means to profane the body and blood of Christ by taking communion unworthily than most Protestants who would consider themselves pretty conservative.
Yeah, very true, very true. And then you could go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's say Lutherans. Some Lutherans are kind of high church, and also, of course, Anglicanism. You have Anglo-Catholic and high church Anglican, where the whole Eucharistic celebration looks a lot like the Mass. In fact, some things, like especially Anglo-Catholics, it could be in Latin.
Yeah. What's interesting is, so there are Anglicans of different stripes. Flannery O'Connor has the famous line where she says, "Scratch an Episcopalian, you'll find almost anything." Right? And you meet an Episcopalian, you met one Episcopalian, and that was more true when she was writing it in the 50s. Now it's a little bit more kind of cut and dry. The camps are a little bit more clearly defined, but some of them, especially those who would refer to themselves as Anglo-Catholics, subscribe to this thing called branch theory. They believe that there are three valid branches of apostolic Christianity. There's the Roman branch, there's the Orthodox branch, and there's the Anglican branch, and they've all got valid succession, they've all got valid orders, and they've all got valid sacraments. Now, the Catholic Church has said, listen, there's things that have been changed in the Anglican ordination rite, and there's things that happened during the Reformation that we can't keep track of. We are not confident in saying that Anglicans have valid apostolic succession. So the Catholic Church doesn't believe that there's an apostolic train going through the Episcopal Church the way that some Anglo-Catholics do. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We had a priest, Father Jonathan Duncan. His episode was fantastic. He came from this sort of branch thing. And as he was coming closer and closer to the Catholic Church and understanding the necessity of apostolic succession for valid Eucharist, mm-hmm. he realized that the best thing he could say as he's presenting the elements is, this might be the body of Christ. And that wasn't good enough for him, right? Yeah. I mean, imagine you're a priest and you're like, this is the best I can say, is this might be. Or imagine that you're someone who believes it's just a symbol. Even the ones who, the Nazarenes and Methodists and Free Methodists, and even some of the non-denominational, extremely non-liturgical house churchy people I was with, when they would present you with communion, they would still say, even though they didn't believe this, they would still say the body of Christ as they handed it to you. Yeah. It's fascinating because it's one of those things that is so varied from congregation to congregation, even within the same denomination, that it's hard to nail down.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned this to you before in the past that, I mean, even individual members within a congregation could have radically different beliefs. Like I had a friend who was a fundamentalist Baptist who was convinced in the real substantial presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Which shocked me because I started on my, I was a young apologist, started on my defense for the real presence. She's like, yeah, I know. I believe that. Yeah.
Oh, you believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, granted, they're believing it based on the words of Scripture, not because they believe in the doctrine of apostolic succession.
Right. That's a good point.
But there's plenty. Cardinal Gibbons says in a great article, a great chapter in his book on, I think it's Faith of the Fathers, where he says there is no doctrine that has a stronger scriptural basis than the Eucharist.
Yeah, absolutely. We're chatting with Matt Swaim about Catholic versus Protestant understandings of Holy Communion and the Lord's Supper. Stay tuned. More to come after this break.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Rumi, and I play Jesus Christ in The Last Days, The Passion and Death of Jesus the Christ. This Lent, I'd love to invite you to join me and my co-director Maria Vargo for a very special live stream broadcast of this production. Beginning Palm Sunday, April 5th, and Holy Thursday, April 9th at noon Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern Time, you'll be able to watch the full program free on our Facebook page or on our website. To watch us on Facebook, go to facebook.com/. The Last Days of Jesus Passion Play, or on our website at www.thelastdayspassionplay.com. While Christians around the world are unable to go to church during Holy Week, we are grateful to be able to bring this beautiful and reverent depiction of Christ's love and sacrifice for all into your homes. I pray you join us, and have a blessed Easter.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Matt Swaim about Protestant versus Catholic understanding of Holy Communion, and also the Lord's Supper. And, Matt, you're right. I mean, there is such a wide variety of different views. And especially, what I found, Matt, is... and then you could take this however way you want. But when it comes to ordinances, they say we do this because they're commanded to do it. And then you say, well, why? Why would our Lord command us to do these specific things? And many times Protestants just don't have an answer to that. It's like, well, we have the crackers and grape juice because the matzah, there's the griddle marks, which remind us of the stripes Jesus bore, and they try to pull out symbolism that actually isn't even there in the text, just trying to make sense of, well, why these particular things? Why would our Lord command it if it doesn't do anything?
All these seemingly arbitrary aspects of the law only to replace them with new, really arbitrary things. Isn't that kind of strange?
Yeah.
But what's even stranger is how much if you're blind to the Catholic teaching on the Eucharist, or it's just foreign to you, or it's just something that's never crossed your mind, all these passages that Catholics take for granted as being Eucharistic don't seem Eucharistic to you. So, for instance, and you run into this all the time when you're talking to a Christian from any denomination on the planet who's taken issue with something the Catholics believe. Mm-hmm. If they want to find the biblical basis for something, they're like, okay, baptism. Let's do a word study, right? Let's get out the concordance, the Strong's Concordance, look up how many times the word baptism comes up and what people say about it. What does Paul say about it? Except when the Catholic Church talks about about baptism, if you look at the Fathers, or if you look at the baptism rite, they're talking about Noah. They're talking about Naaman the Syrian. They're talking about the Spirit hovering over the waters in creation. They're talking about the people of Israel crossing through the waters of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They're talking about all this other stuff. And the Eucharist is the same way. Yeah. Once you realize what it is and what it symbolizes, and what beyond just what it symbolizes, it's a symbol that is what it signifies. Right? Then things start to jump out to you, from the manna in the desert, which is one of the examples Jesus himself uses to talk about the Eucharist, to the whole Passover sacrifice and what that means, because that's not something that we necessarily would have connected. We would have said that Jesus is commemorating the escape to Egypt, not necessarily the slaying of the lamb. Yeah. It's interesting in a lot of ways, because the stuff that you just don't see, because nobody's ever really told you, given you that particular hermeneutic to look at the scriptures and particularly salvation history in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, I had William Albrecht on earlier in the week. We were talking about the sacrifice of the Mass. And one point he made was, if you're a New Testament Christian and that's all you look at, the sacrificial language doesn't really jump out at you. But when you take the whole Old Testament and bring it to bear on those texts, then it's like in Technicolor.
Yeah. What is this? This is, there are a number of ways that this started to kind of make sense to me. I believed it before I felt it. I was one of those people where my mind was converted on the Eucharist before my heart really caught up. But one of the things that was part of that was this realization that what is the central event in the Old Testament? What is the event that gets talked about in almost every book of the Old Testament? Remember that I delivered you out of the land of Egypt. The central event in the Old Testament is the Exodus. Well, what's the central event of the Exodus? It's the Passover, right? And this is something that was crucial to Jewish worship. This is what the Hebrew children are. This is what their whole identity comes from. There's a reason that the Ten Commandments is everybody's favorite movie, whether Jewish or Christian or whatever. It's because it's all of our story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so you were converted more from the head, just looking at the biblical data, and then eventually your heart caught up. I mean, was it after you came into? Well, it must have happened before you came into the church.
It did happen before. Some people will walk into the Catholic Church for the first time and they'll see the priest elevate the host and they'll say, have that Thomas in the upper room moment where they say, "My Lord and my God," and they just know. For me, it was more like, I had kind of figured all this stuff out before I ever visited Mass for the first time. Yeah. And it was a very different thing than what I'd read about. But I mention all the time about how pivotal Flannery O'Connor was in sort of renewing my imagination. And I think the line from her, one of her letters, where she's talking about being at some late night dinner with a bunch of people, she didn't have much to say to the room. And then at one point late in the evening, one of these kind of well-to-do sort of former Catholic Episcopalian ladies says, I don't really, do the whole Catholic thing, but that, the bread and the wine, that's a comforting symbol, I think. And Flannery O'Connor in her only line of the night just says, well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. That resonated with me almost more than any argument. Just because of, that's one of those choose you this day kind of lines. It's like It's like a liar lunatic Lord's sort of presentation of what the Eucharist is. Either it is what we believed it is as Christians until it was disputed in the 16th century, or it's not. Yeah. And there's so many ways to discuss this. How is it possible? Because a lot of this was logic for me. How is it possible that when God says, "Let there be light," there is light, but when Jesus, who is God, says, "This is my body," nothing happens? That's the kind of stuff that sort of you have to mull over once you start to think about these things.
Right. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, that point was recognized by the early reformers. It's either if the Mass is true and Christ is present, then to worship him is worship, in the truest sense. And if it isn't, then it's the worst possible blasphemy. As
That's what John Calvin said. He said that the Mass is the highest form of idolatry.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
You're worshiping the stuff of earth.
Yeah, and you kind of echoed Augustine. It's Augustine said we don't sin by adoring it, but we do sin by not adoring it. Not adoring Christ's body and blood.
Yeah, it's interesting too because when I discovered that Catholics did daily Mass, I had an objection that a lot of people have, and when I sort of discovered the repetitive nature of Catholic liturgy. You start to think, well, this is just going to make people get used to it. So, but interestingly enough, John Wesley wrote a piece that will occasionally get brought up in like Methodist seminaries and stuff about the need for constant communion, because he was one of those persons who believed not only in weekly, but sometimes a couple times a week communion. And he answers an objection in one of these sermons that people say, he says something to the effect, people say that if you're receiving this communion, if you're following this ordinance too often, then you will lose reverence for the ordinance. He's like, well, apply that to any other law of God. Does following "thou shalt not kill" too often make you, more open to killing?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he said, and even if it does that mean that God's law is subject to the way that we happen to feel about it in a particular moment?
Yeah.
That even John Wesley, who had a lot more Catholic view of what communion means than a lot of the people who descended from him. Even he knew that there was something different about this.
Yeah,
So,
did he advocate the frequent reception of communion?
He did. He and his brother Charles as well, the great hymn writer, whose hymns show up in Catholic hymnals, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because I know as a cradle Catholic, we don't realize that non-Catholic churches, they don't celebrate the Eucharist daily or sometimes even
and they don't call it the
quarterly.
Eucharist.
Yeah, it's quarterly. That.
It's great. We got a written story. I can't even remember the guy who done it, but there's a written conversion story on our site, and it was a guy who was talking about how his journey to the Catholic Church came when he was at a Bible study, and one of his friends, kind of said, "Guys, I'm sorry, but I'm leaving, First Harvest Communion Fellowship of the Redeemer Baptist Church or whatever, to go back to my Catholic roots and to go back and receive the Eucharist." And the guy is like, "The what?" That's not a word that we.
It's not part of the vocab, huh?
It's not. No, it's not part of it. It's like we got to Google that, man. And that's the way it was for me. We always called it communion or the Lord's Supper, but we'd have never called it the Eucharist. So that's a bit of a language barrier thing that you sometimes when Catholics talk about the Eucharist, they don't even realize that the Protestant eyes that they're discussing are totally glazed over.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's very important to recognize those differences in terminology. And unfortunately, with Catholics, especially those defending the faith, we're so used to talking to other Catholics and reading Catholic sources that stuff like that just completely is off the radar screen. And you're right. You're talking to somebody, they might not have a clue what you're talking about because they never heard of the word Eucharist before.
Yeah. What's funny is when we help people kind of write up their conversion stories, we try to remind them, because once you've been in the Catholic faith, even if you come from another background for a while, you tend to, pick up the language a little bit. And so we have to remind people that not everybody who's reading this story is going to know what you're talking about. So some people will be like, well, I was prostrating myself before the monstrance in the Perpetual Adoration Chapel when I had this. And the Protestants like, you were whatting before the what? So
right.
So that's kind of helpful to define terms. And it's also, I think, helpful to remind our Protestant brothers and sisters that don't understand this, that the core of why we do this is because we are sticking as hard and close and fast as we can to the Scriptures. Yeah. And as hard and close as we can to the teachings of Jesus. It's not because we don't take Jesus seriously that we've decided that we're going to have some guy in, a funny outfit say some words and then we're going to, eat something. No, this is exactly what we understand Jesus told us to do. Right. And we can point to the part in the Bible where we believe he said this stuff. And it's in your Bible, too. You can look it up.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, we're chatting with Matt Swaim of Coming Home Network. Check out their website, chnetwork.org. But don't go away because we got a lot more to come with Matt on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics.
Jesus said in Luke 17, "When you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.'" According to St. John of the Cross, God is pleased with the little deeds we do in secret. He takes more pleasure in these than in a multitude of grand works that we may do out of the desire to be seen by others. May God help us to do the things that please Him, and not just to appear great in the eyes of others.
Attention VMPR listeners. We've talked at length about the attack on our youth through popular culture media, but what if I told you there was someone trying to make a difference? The newest novel, Britfield and the Lost Crown, by C.R. Stewart, is reaching schools across America and sharing Christian morals alongside great storytelling. What if I told you that this mission needs your help? To reach more children, Britfield and the Lost Crown need funding for their ongoing book tour. If you're interested in making a difference, if you're interested in buying the book, or are curious and want more information, go to BritfieldInstitute.org. That's BRITFIELD Institute.org. Or email media@bretfield.com. Help open up the world of Bretfield and the Lost Crown to people everywhere.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Matt Swaim about Catholic versus Protestant understanding of Holy Communion and the Lord's Supper. And right before the break, Matt, you made a really interesting point that often Catholics are accused of not going by the words of Scripture, and always looking for other symbolic interpretations and stuff. But when it comes to the words of institution, this is my body, this cup is the covenant, my blood. All of a sudden, zoom, the Protestants stop being literalist, and this is all symbolic.
Well, all literalists are selective anyway. What's the psalm? The psalm which says that God, the Father, owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I figured God probably owns more hills than that. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Right.
But I think also too, it's that we as Catholics have this sort of continuation, this patrimony, this unbroken line of a specific interpretation of what the Scriptures mean, so that there are things that are semi-euphemistic in the Scriptures that have always had kind of this steady understanding and vocabularial context in the Church, whereas if you come at the Scriptures without any context, you just kind of imbue them with your own context. I'll give you the example that makes the most sense to me in this, the breaking of the bread. Right? It says a number of times in the book of Acts. It says in Luke's gospel as well, this idea of the breaking of the bread. So at the road to the Emmaus, Jesus dines with them. This is still Passover time, right? And he disappears in the breaking of the bread. Right, and they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. And it says that in the Acts of the Apostles, the early church devoted themselves to the breaking of the bread. That was a way for them to say the Eucharist. Paul talks about this as well. But if you don't realize that that's the traditional term that was used for the Eucharist among early Christians, the breaking of the bread, then you miss it, right? You just don't you don't get it. But the other thing with that is that Jesus says a lot of things about himself, and some people will say, well, Jesus says he's the bread of life, and whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has life, and all this stuff that's going on in John 6. And a lot of Christians who object to Catholic teaching on the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist will say, well, he's just being symbolic. He says, I am the door, right? Or I am the light of the world. He's just being symbolic, like he is in all those other cases. And that I feel like I bought into that argument until I started doing some thinking, until I started doing some church history. This is the only thing that Jesus says I am about, that there was a consistent and codified Christian practice that's traceable to the earliest days of the church, all the way to the pages of the New Testament. So, Jesus says that he's the light of the world, but you don't find throughout the first centuries of Christianity these people, Christians, walking around in glow-in-the-dark robes because Jesus said he was the light of the world, right? You don't see people who are walking around with big planks on them because Jesus said that I am the door. What you do see is people having bread consecrated and saying that this is the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist when he says, I am the bread of life. So that's qualitatively different in the way that the earliest Christians understood what Jesus was saying in that statement, especially in John 6 when he says it 3 times and then people walk away because it's a hard saying.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Also, when we're talking about the real presence, we kind of have it's a uphill discussion, because one thing you have is rationalism, where someone could just, it's just rationally easier to dismiss it as a metaphor, right? And then on the other side, you have this other thing against works. Well, if communion is more than just a symbol, then it's a work, and we're forbidden. I mean, we're saved by faith, not by works. So it can't have any...
Unless Jesus told you to do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean... Jesus,
yeah, that's the clause, isn't it?
It's right. I mean, if Jesus tells you, it's like, we don't believe in work salvation, but we do believe you should do everything that Jesus said. Well, dude, what's the difference? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
That's a little hair splitty, if you ask me. But I've heard that argument. I've made that argument.
Really? Yeah. But would you say, therefore, if you don't do it, that it wouldn't affect your salvation?
Okay, so rephrase that. I want to make sure I know what you're asking.
Yeah, so if you, like, your former position was, it's, we're saved by faith, not by works, but Jesus commands us to do this. If someone said, well, what happened if you don't do it? Would you say, well, my salvation would be imperiled or inhibited at all?
I would say that if I didn't follow the commands and teachings of Jesus, they would be imperiled. But I would have thought that this particular command of Jesus was just, crackers and juice once every third Saturday, maybe? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what that means. Like, how are you supposed to even decide how often you're supposed to schedule a communion service?
Yeah, right.
I mean, all we've got to go on is, what did the early Christians do? What do the people who learned from the apostles do? And what they did is they created a liturgy that was based largely on Passover and largely on, Jewish worship, and that read from the Old Testament and from the letters of the apostles and from the Gospels as they were being developed, and that's the Mass.
Yeah.
And it's essentially, pieces of it have been sort of developed and fine-tuned over the centuries, but it's the same thing that we do whenever we go to Mass. It's the same structure. The liturgy of the table preceded by the liturgy of the word.
Yeah, very good. Matt, another thing I wanted to ask you on, and you've already touched on this with your own journey of faith, is that you recognize that there was this disparity in belief versus practice, about how can you reverence something when, it's just a tiny little piece of bread and a cup of grape juice. And I've noticed that this is a kind of a common thread for many people who come to believe in the real presence, is when they're in a faith tradition whose practice doesn't reflect, what they believe, no matter what it is, about the Eucharist.
Yeah, and it's tricky. And I think, for me, there's this sense among a lot of Protestants that what the Catholic claim is just so far out, man. It's so wacky and so medieval and so just it's just over the top. It's, of course, the words of institution in Latin are hoc est anum corpus meum, and even the medieval punsters would say it's just a bunch of hoc est pocus, and that's where the word hocus pocus comes from. They just think it's magic spells and weird gobbledygook. But if you think about it, if you know sort of the Aristotelian roots of what the Catholics mean by a word like transubstantiation, which is what the church has already believed from the beginning, but didn't get a word for it officially until like the Council of Trent. And it's just a matter of substance and accidents. In Aristotelian philosophy, substance is what a thing is. You are a Gary, and there's no change in that, right? Mm-hmm. Even if I chop off your arm, even if I, punch you and give you a black eye, even if I paint your hair purple, you are a Gary, right? The substance is the Gary. The accidents is the color of your hair, your 8'4" height, your whatever it happens to be, right? That's the accidents. And so what changes is the substance. And that's a pretty logical thing to understand if you take a second to pay attention to what Catholics are actually teaching. Mm-hmm. The substance of what it is changes when the priest says, this is my body, right? It still appears bread and wine. Accidents are still going to be the same. It's still going to taste like bread. It's still going to taste like wine. But what it is something completely and wholly different. But we believe that about other sacraments too, right? Like you were a single guy, but when you became married, your whole who you were-ness changed, right? That's in that sacrament. You were now forever a spouse of somebody. And that's the kind of thing that we believe about the other sacraments too. But I think that a lot of, non-Catholics just think that we believe in like wizards and Harry Potter junk or something.
Yeah.
And that's not where we're coming from. It's a very actually rational position.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Very literal, very rational, but it's not rationalistic though. That's the difference.
It's not.
It's not. Well, we could boil these texts down to what like I could accept as on a human level. Because it's not merely a human who said, this is my body. It's the God.
No, it's not. It's the Word made flesh who dwelt among us. But what's funny is that, a lot of Protestants are kind of okay with the Orthodox. I think mostly because they have no idea what the Orthodox are talking about on a few things. Like I have a bunch of friends who I went to college with who were becoming more liturgically minded, more sacramentally minded, and they decided they were going to become Orthodox rather than Catholic. First of all, well, for a number of reasons, but first of all, because their mothers and fathers didn't know what Theotokos meant, so they didn't know that they were into Marian idolatry, which is, of course, they're not into Marian idolatry either. But right. Or the Orthodox believe the exact same thing we do about the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, but they don't have the word transubstantiation. We in the West, who are descendants of Aristotelian philosophy, have to have like kind of a reasonable explanation for everything. So we have to have like the logic and the science set out. The Orthodox are just like, it's a mystery, but it's him, and that's good enough, right? It's the same belief that we have, which is why, it's so much easier when you hear about ecumenical talks going on in the Vatican with whoever. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't even have to discuss when it's Catholics talking with Orthodox, because we already, to begin with, believe the same thing about Holy Communion.
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, Matt, boy, I can't believe our time has flown, but we have a couple minutes.
It always does with you, Gary.
Time flies when you're having fun, Matt. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with Coming Home Network.
Yeah, Coming Home Network, if you head to our site, you can find over 1,000 conversion stories of people who've come into the church from every background you can possibly imagine, even people who've come back to the church after being baptized Catholic and who've wandered away. If you are on your own journey and looking for support, we have a pastoral care team that is willing to stand by you. Have an online community you can plug into full of people who have made the journey too and are there to help. And I would just ask that anybody who's frustrated that they can't receive communion right now, I would just ask that you offer up that frustration and that hunger for all of our members who were preparing to be received into the church on Holy Saturday at the Easter Vigil and are now being put on hold indefinitely due to restrictions. Let's just have our hunger be in solidarity with all of them.
Absolutely.
So chnetwork.org, come visit.
That's really important point too, because I know I work with the parish RCIA. It's heartbreaking because they've gone through the journey and they're ready to come in,
and some of them have been working for 10 years and they finally got the nerve.
Yeah, I know. Well, Matt, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Always, Gary. I love it.
All right. Matt Swaim, ladies and gentlemen. Again, that's chnetwork.org. Check it out. Lots of great resources. Talk about lots of great resources. Next week, we're going to have John DeRosa, Ken Hensley, Christine Flynn, Dr. Paul Thigpen, and Eric Ibarra. So it's going to be an action-packed week. I wish everybody have a happy and holy Triduum. And coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you at the Terry and Jesse Show. Stay tuned, folks. God bless. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.